The Ancestral Trail, Book 10, Zibella's Fortress. First published by Marshall Cavendish, 1993. Based on a story by Frank Graves. Yellow flames and smoke filled the wood behind them as Richard, Orcan and Melek leapt into the lake. The three hit the water together, and now they were swimming vigorously. Their one aim was to get to the opposite shore as quickly as possible. There was no telling how safe the water was. If the earth itself could catch fire, there was no reason why the lake should not too. Weighed down by the Book of Prophecies on his back, Melek could barely keep his head above the water. "Are you okay?" Richard asked the dwarf, swimming alongside him.
"Yes, I'm fine,"
Melek spluttered back.
"I'll get the hang of it soon."
Melek was as good as his word. Before long he was moving forwards with a slow but steady breaststroke, while Orcan thrashed alongside in his wake like a paddle steamer. Richard swam behind them, ready to help if they got into any trouble. From dry land, the lake had looked quite narrow, but now they were in the water, it seemed much wider. As they swam along, Richard could have sworn it was getting wider still. After a while, he turned his head to check how far they had come. He saw the same expanse of blue. There was no shore, no sign of land, no hint of anything but water. Richard trod water for a moment, trying to grasp the situation. As he did so, he felt a tugging at his feet, as if a current was pushing him to one side. He called to Orcan and Melek, but his words were drowned by a sudden throaty gurgling. An enormous plug seemed to have been pulled out from the bottom of the lake. The current gripped him with full strength. Richard had heard of whirlpools, but he had never seen one. Now he was in one, pinned to a swirling wall of water that sank straight down into the lake. Below him, swept along by the same circular current that had suddenly risen from beneath the surface, Orcan and Melek were being carried down into a cauldron of spray. Noise was everywhere, gurgling, splashing, a jumble of buffeting sounds that drowned everything else. The three whirled round in ever-decreasing circles. The sky grew dimmer, the noise louder. Orcan and Melek had already disappeared. Now it was Richard's turn to vanish beneath the spray. Richard landed painfully on a cold stone floor. Beside him, the other two were rubbing their wet, bruised bodies. "Where are we?" Richard asked. "What just happened?"
"Magic," Melek said. "Listen to this." He read from a soggy page in the Book of Prophecies. "A landing from the Witch's Brew in spellbound lands of fear. Battle nightmares 1, then 2, ending 3 in crystals clear. Revoke the spell, the book will tell, testaments beginning C. Add 4 elements, make a spell, say the word that sets them free."
"You're right," Richard said after Melek had finished. "Witch's Brew describes that whirlpool perfectly. We must be on the shores of the lands of fear." Richard looked around. They were in a cave. A faint red glow from a single rocky passage provided the only light source. "Well, we don't have much choice," Richard said, heading for the opening. The others squelched after him. As the trio made their way through the passage, the walls seemed to start to move. They were moving closer together. The roof was getting lower. Then they heard a loud crunch behind them, as roof, walls, and floor met in a rocky kiss. "The tunnel's closing up!" Richard shouted. "Run!" They stumbled along, chased by a gritty rumble as the passage steadily squeezed shut in their wake. Rounding a corner, they saw that the passage was closing in front as well as behind. Through its narrow opening, they glimpsed the safety of a cave. Richard and Orcan made it in time, but just as Melek was about to dive through, the walls nipped him neatly by the book on his back. Orcan leapt forward and helped Melek wriggle free from the straps which bound him to his load. Richard made a grab for the book, but it was stuck fast, its leather cover creaking under the pressure. Richard drew his dagger and began battering the rock with its hilt. At last he was able to loosen a stone, enough to snatch the Book of Prophecies free. Then the tunnel closed with an angry snap. A shaken Melek strapped the book back onto his shoulders, while the others took stock of their surroundings. Once again they were in a cave, with only one way out. Richard was about to speak, when the tunnel floor seemed to come alive, creeping towards them, rustling, twitching, crawling, a brown mass interspersed with flickers of red. Suddenly, thousands of beady red eyes were staring at the trio. "Rats!" Richard yelled. "Thousands of them!" "Get to the tunnel's mouth," Orcan ordered, his soldiers' training coming right out. "If we can catch them there, we'll have a chance. If they surround us in the cave, we're finished." Orcan drew his sword and jumped, slashing and stabbing into the horde of rodents. Richard and Melek hurried to protect his back, and together the three forged their way down the passage. For every one of the beasts they killed, another took its place. There seemed no end of them. Then Richard noticed that each time Orcan's sword slashed through a rat, its corpse vanished. Not all at once, but slowly, until there was nothing left. Looking behind him, he saw the tunnel floor was hazy with ghostly shapes that dwindled fainter and fainter, until they finally popped out of existence altogether. "It's a trick!" he called to Orcan. "Remember the prophecy spoke about nightmares? It must be an illusion of some sort. These things aren't real." All at once, the rats turned tail and fled, receding into the tunnel like a boiling wave of brown fur. In their place came a slithering noise, interspersed with strange scraping sounds. Then, into their field of vision, crept the biggest rat any of them had ever seen. If it was all an illusion, Richard thought to himself, then they needed to burst it like a balloon. He drew his dagger and flung it straight at the giant rat's vicious-looking face. Richard's aim was true. The dagger sunk into the rat's eye. But the creature did not disappear. Instead, it swelled, bigger and bigger, bulging against the rock until its insides burst under the strain. Blood slopped from its open mouth, and for a second everything was still. Then the rat exploded in thick clouds of smoke. When the air cleared, the three found themselves in a cave made entirely from crystal. Small beads of condensation ran down the carved surfaces, adding an extra dimension to the light. A woman in robes of shimmering blue stood by a throne of prisms. "You've done well to come this far," she hissed, "but you will go no further." "Who are you?" Richard asked bravely. "I am Zibella, the all-powerful," she boomed as she raised her hands and began a strange chant. Richard felt a numb pins and needles prickling in his limbs. His feet were as heavy as lead, and his forehead was sweating. Streaks of cold blue light lanced from her fingertips as Zibella stopped chanting and shouted, "Here, now, forever!" Richard, Orcan and Melek could not move. The crystal wall seemed to spring away, receding with sickening speed, as if the cave were getting bigger. It was not that, but the three of them were getting smaller. Smaller and greener, and wartier, and springier, and croakier, and web-footed. Richard raised one splay-fingered hand and stared at it through bulging eyes. A thin, black tongue licked out. His tongue! He blinked, and then he hopped. The movement took him by surprise. He had landed on all fours. Then he saw two toads. One was thin, with spectacles on its nose, and a huge book on its back. The other toad was fatter and angrier, but both had the same puzzled expression. "What's happening?" Orcan and Melek spoke at the same time. "Zibella's turned us into toads," Richard replied, forming the words with some difficulty. For a while there was chaos, as Orcan hopped about uncontrollably, and Melek struggled out from under the book. In the time it took his companions to settle down, Richard sensed Golan's voice telling him to find the Book of Reversals and use the magic word from the prophecy. Can you remember the prophecy? Richard asked Melek urgently.
Of course,
the Melek toad croaked, and he somehow managed to belch out the words of the riddle. Testament's beginning C, Richard croaked as Melek finished. Join the first letter of each line, and we get Libertas. Now, we must find the Book of Reversals. They hopped in different directions, searching frantically. But it was Melek who finally found the book, encased within a huge crystal. They managed to open the book and flip the pages until they found the spell.
Libertas. Glean by the fire of candlelight, from earth a crystal sparkling bright. Dip in well water, a droplet lingers there, which turns to a bubble and rides the air. Your mortal self awaits the time to rebel. Shout Libertas, and break the sordid spell.
Well, that's what the end of the prophecy meant. We've got to find 4 elements as well as the magic word, Richard said, his lids falling heavily over his speckled toad eyes. Let's look around the cave. Even as he spoke, Richard realised that the 4 elements were right there beside him. A candle flickered by the book, and water dripped from the crystal walls into a shallow pool. Richard felt his powerful leg muscles tighten as he leapt at the candle. The column of wax toppled over and knocked a blue crystal into the pool. As the crystal hit the water, a perfect rainbow-coloured bubble rose into the air. In the wink of an eye, Richard realised that the 4 elements had been linked. Libertas! Richard shouted without hesitation. As the word left Richard's mouth, time began to unwind in reverse. The crystal walls of the cave seemed to be closing in on them at a terrifying rate. There was a subtle ripping noise, as if a hole had been torn in the very fabric of the air itself, and all movement ceased. The 3 were back to their normal shapes. Richard gave an experimental hop and jarred his heels. The magic had worked. They looked around the cave and saw Zibella perched on her throne of prisms. Her evil, ice-cold stare sent a chill through Richard and Melek. But Orcan's face was puce with rage. He seized his bow, pulled out an arrow, and took aim at the glowering witch. In the microsecond it took for him to release his bowfinger, Zibella had cast another spell. Spurts of flame shot from her fingers, and Orcan swiveled so that his arrow was pointing at Richard. It leapt free with a soft twang. Her spell was wasted. As soon as he saw her hand rise, Melek had guessed what was about to happen. His own hand shot out to give Orcan's a rough shove. It was enough to spoil the archer's aim. The arrow hissed past Richard's ear and clinked uselessly against a crystal wall. Orcan turned back to his original target. Zibella's calm features were changing. She began to laugh, first softly, then louder. As her squeals filled the air, a large crack split the ground alongside Orcan's feet, and he lowered his bow in confusion. A second crack jagged through the floor in front of him. Then another, and another. The cracks began to widen into gaping crevasses whose edges crumbled and fell in on themselves. Crystal columns teetered and fell, and above it all, the crash of shattering crystal, the groan of tortured bedrock, the rumble of falling boulders, rang the high, clear screech of Zibella's mad laughter. Her mirth came in spurts and jags, ear-splitting cackles of merriment that rang remorselessly through her crystal cavern. At the time she began to change, her icy beauty turning into the withered features of an old hag. Zibella's hair thinned and shrank back on her scalp, her cheeks wrinkled and sank, and her eyes pouched and glazed over into opaque pebbles. Her whole body hunched over, and even her clothes disintegrated into rags. Soon she was little more than a withered black shape that capered madly from crystal to crystal. Richard looked around in desperation. The floor had cracked like crazy paving into a number of islands that grew smaller and further apart with each second. They had only one chance. "Follow me!" he shouted, and launched himself into the abyss.